How America Went from 13 to 50. The Ultimate State Formation Timeline. 1. The Epic Hook, The Impossible Dream. The story of America's expansion began with an impossible dream. Picture this. It's 1776, and the entire United States consists of just 13 tiny colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast like barnacles on a ship. The total area, a mere 360,000 square miles. Everything west of the Appalachian Mountains was uncharted wilderness, home to Native American nations and wild beasts that European settlers had never seen. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. In just 172 years, these 13 struggling colonies would transform into a continental empire, spanning 3.8 million square miles. That's more than 10 times larger. From sea to shining sea, America would become the most powerful nation on Earth. But how? How did a collection of rebellious farmers and merchants create the greatest expansion in human history? The answer lies not in conquest alone, but in a revolutionary idea that had never been tried before. That ordinary people could govern themselves and build something extraordinary. This is the ultimate timeline of how America went from 13 to 50 states, and it's more incredible than any Hollywood movie. 2. The foundation. 13 colonies become a nation. Let's start at the beginning. The 13 original colonies weren't even united when they declared independence. Massachusetts hated Virginia. New York looked down on Pennsylvania. These weren't states yet. They were separate entities with different cultures, economies, and even currencies. But something magical happened during the Revolutionary War. As they fought together against the British Empire, these colonies began to see themselves as something new, Americans. When the war ended in 1783, they faced a choice that would determine the fate of the continent. Would they remain separate nations, constantly fighting each other like the city-states of ancient Greece? Or would they unite under a single government? The answer came in 1787 with the Constitutional Convention. In a sweltering Philadelphia summer, 55 men created a document that would change the world. But here's what most people don't know. The Constitution wasn't just about creating a government. It was about creating a system for expansion. The founders knew that America wouldn't stop at 13 states. They were already dreaming of a continental empire. 3. The blueprint for expansion. Northwest Ordinance. The genius of American expansion wasn't military conquest. It was bureaucracy. In 1787, the same year as a constitutional convention, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance. This single document created the blueprint for how territories could become states, and it's still used today. The process was revolutionary in its simplicity. When a territory reached 60,000 free inhabitants, it could apply for statehood. No kings, no royal approval, no centuries of waiting.
The measures proposed in this pamphlet are sound, I believe.
Aye, but we must ensure the representation remains fair for all counties.
Just democracy in action. But here's the brilliant part. New states would be equal to the original 13. They wouldn't be colonies or second-class territories. They would have the same rights, the same representation, the same power. This was unprecedented in human history. When the Roman Empire expanded, conquered territories remained provinces forever. When the British Empire grew, colonies stayed colonies. But America created a system where territories could become full partners in the Union. This single idea would drive the greatest peaceful expansion in world history. The Northwest Ordinance also did something else revolutionary. It banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. This created a precedent that would later tear the nation apart, but it also established the principle that expansion could be used to spread freedom, not just power. 4. The First Wave. States, 14 to 17. The first test of the new system came quickly. Vermont, which had been an independent republic during the Revolutionary War, became the 14th state in 1791. Think about that. Vermont was literally its own country with its own currency and government before joining the United States. Kentucky followed in 1792, carved out of Virginia's Western Territory. Then came Tennessee in 1796, split off from North Carolina. These weren't random additions. They represented something profound. Americans were already pushing beyond the original colonial boundaries, creating new communities in the wilderness. But the real shock came with Ohio in 1803. Ohio was the first state created entirely from the Northwest Territory, the first test of whether the new system would actually work. When Ohio joined the Union, it proved that the American experiment could expand beyond the original 13 colonies. Here's what's fascinating. Each of these early states faced the same challenge. They had to create governments from scratch, establish laws, build infrastructure, and integrate with the existing Union. They were literally inventing American democracy as they went along. 5. The game changer, Louisiana Purchase. Then came 1803, and everything changed. President Thomas Jefferson faced a crisis that would define America's future. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, controlled the vast Louisiana Territory, everything from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. American farmers needed access to the Mississippi River to ship their goods, but Napoleon could cut off that access at any time. Jefferson sent diplomats to France with instructions to buy New Orleans for $10 million. But when they arrived, Napoleon made an offer that stunned the world. He would sell the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. That's about 4 cents per acre for 828,000 square miles of land. But here's the shocking part. Jefferson wasn't even sure he had the constitutional authority to make the purchase. The Constitution didn't explicitly give the president power to buy territory. Jefferson agonized over the decision for weeks. Should he follow the Constitution strictly and lose this incredible opportunity? Or should he stretch his powers to secure America's future? Jefferson chose expansion. In one stroke of the pen, he doubled the size of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase would eventually create 15 new states, from Louisiana to Montana. It was the greatest real estate deal in human history, and it established a precedent. When opportunity knocked, America would answer. 6. The rush west. Gold, glory, and manifest destiny. The Louisiana Purchase unleashed something that had been building in the American spirit, the belief that the continent was their destiny. By the 1840s, this feeling had a name: manifest destiny. Americans believed it was their God-given right to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But belief alone doesn't move people across 2,000 miles of wilderness. What drove the greatest migration in human history was opportunity. The Oregon Trail promised fertile farmland in the Pacific Northwest. The California gold rush of 1849 brought 300,000 people to the West Coast in just 2 years. Families abandoned everything they knew for the promise of land, gold, and freedom. Picture this: wagon trains stretching for miles across the Great Plains. Families carrying everything they owned in a single covered wagon. Children walking hundreds of miles beside oxen. Women giving birth on the prairie with no doctor for hundreds of miles. Men dying of cholera and being buried in unmarked graves along the trail. The human cost was staggering. An estimated 20,000 people died on the Oregon Trail alone. But for every person who died, 10 more took their place. The promise of the West was stronger than the fear of death. But there was another cost that Americans are only now beginning to understand. This expansion came at the expense of Native American nations that had lived on these lands for thousands of years. The Trail of Tears forced 100,000 Native Americans from their ancestral homes. Entire cultures were nearly destroyed in the name of progress. 7. War and expansion. Mexican-American War. By 1845, American expansion had reached a crisis point. Texas had been an independent republic since 1836, but Mexico still claimed it. California was Mexican territory, but American settlers were pouring in. The stage was set for conflict. President James K. Polk was elected on a platform of expansion. He wanted California, he wanted New Mexico, and he wanted to settle the Texas border once and for all. When Mexico refused to sell these territories, Polk found his excuse for war. The Mexican-American War lasted from 1846 to 1848, and it was a complete American victory. But the real prize wasn't military glory. It was land. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the United States the Mexican cession, 500 into 25,000 square miles that would become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Think about that for a moment. 7 future states were created from a single war. America now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, fulfilling the dream of manifest destiny. But this expansion came with a terrible price. It reignited the slavery debate that would eventually tear the nation apart. Here's what's crucial to understand. Every acre of new territory raised the same question. Would it be slave or free? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had temporarily solved this problem, but the Mexican cession made it impossible to ignore. The expansion that made America great also brought it to the brink of civil war. 8. The Great Divide, Civil War Era. By 1860, the United States had 33 states, but the Union was fracturing. The expansion that had made America powerful had also made it impossible to govern. Every new state meant a new battle over slavery. Would Kansas be slave or free? What about Nebraska, California? The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final straw. Before he even took office, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 10 more states followed, creating the Confederate States of America. The great American experiment in expansion and democracy seemed doomed to failure. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was the bloodiest conflict in American history. Over 600,000 Americans died fighting each other. Entire cities were burned to the ground. Families were torn apart. The very idea of the United States hung in the balance. But here's what's remarkable. Even during the Civil War, expansion continued. Nevada became a state in 1864, specifically to provide more electoral votes for Lincoln's re-election. The Transcontinental Railroad continued construction, even as the nation tore itself apart. Americans never stopped believing in their continental destiny, even when they were killing each other. When the Union finally won in 1865, it wasn't just a military victory. It was a victory for the idea that the United States could expand and remain united. The question of slavery was settled forever, clearing the way for the final phase of continental expansion. 9. Reconstruction and Western push. The end of the Civil War unleashed a new wave of westward expansion. Millions of Americans, including freed slaves, headed west looking for new opportunities. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to farm it for 5 years. It was the greatest land giveaway in history. But the real game changer was technology. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected the east and west coasts for the first time. What had once taken months by wagon train now took just days by train. The West was no longer a distant frontier. It was part of America. This period saw the creation of some of America's most iconic states. Colorado became a state in 1876, exactly 100 years after the Declaration of Independence. North Dakota and South Dakota joined in 1889, followed by Montana and Washington the same year. Idaho and Wyoming completed the continental United States in 1890. Each of these states had its own unique story. Colorado was built on silver mining. The Dakotas were carved up to give Republicans more senators. Montana was the last refuge of the American cowboy. Washington was built on lumber and fishing. But they all shared one thing. They were the final pieces of the continental puzzle. 10. The Railroad Revolution. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 was more than just an engineering marvel. It was the moment America truly became a continental nation. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Point, Utah, it connected not just 2 coasts, but 2 different Americas. The railroad changed everything. Cattle could be shipped from Texas to Chicago in days instead of months. Wheat from Kansas could reach New York markets while still fresh. People could travel from coast to coast in comfort and safety. The railroad didn't just connect existing cities, it created new ones. But here's what most people don't realize. The railroad companies were given massive land grants by the federal government. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads received over 20 million acres of land, an area larger than South Carolina. They sold this land to settlers, creating instant communities along the railroad lines. The railroad also accelerated the destruction of Native American cultures. Buffalo herds that had sustained Plains Indians for centuries were slaughtered to feed railroad workers and clear the tracks. The railroad brought soldiers who could quickly respond to any Native American resistance. By 1890, the Indian Wars were effectively over, and the frontier was declared closed. 11. The final continental push. By 1890, the continental United States was essentially complete, but there were still territories waiting for statehood. Utah had been denied statehood for decades because of the Mormon practice of polygamy. Oklahoma was Indian territory set aside for Native Americans forced from their eastern homelands. New Mexico and Arizona were considered too Mexican, too wild, too different to be proper American states. But the 20th century brought new pressures for statehood. The Spanish-American War of 1898 made America a global power, and global powers needed to look unified and strong. Oklahoma became a state in 1907, combining Indian Territory with Oklahoma Territory. It was a symbolic end to the policy of setting aside separate lands for Native Americans. New Mexico and Arizona had to wait until 1912, and their admission was controversial. Many Americans worried that these territories were too Hispanic, too Catholic, too foreign to be proper American states. But the discovery of copper and oil made them too valuable to ignore. When they finally joined the Union, the continental United States was complete. For the first time in American history, there were no more territories waiting for statehood. The frontier was closed. The continent was settled. America stretched from sea to shining sea, just as the founders had dreamed. And 12. The 20th century surprises. Most Americans thought the story was over. 48 states seemed like enough. The continent was full, the frontier was closed, and America was focused on becoming a world power. But the 20th century had two more surprises in store. The first surprise was strategic. World War II showed that America needed military bases in the Pacific and the Arctic. Alaska and Hawaii, which had been territories for decades, suddenly became crucial to national defense. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 proved that Hawaii was America's front line in the Pacific. The Cold War made Alaska America's front line against the Soviet Union. The second surprise was political. Alaska and Hawaii had been territories for so long that most Americans forgot they existed. Alaska had been a territory since 1867, Hawaii since 1898. But after World War II, both territories began demanding statehood. They had fought for America, they had died for America, and they wanted to be full partners in the American experiment. The path to statehood wasn't easy. Many Americans worried that Alaska was too remote, too sparsely populated, too different to be a proper state. Others worried that Hawaii was too Asian, too Pacific, too foreign. But the Cold War changed everything. America needed to show the world that democracy could include anyone, anywhere. 13. Alaska, the frozen gamble. Alaska The frozen gamble, Alaska's path to statehood, began with what critics called Seward's folly. In 1867, Secretary of State William Seward purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Critics mocked it as a frozen wasteland, a waste of money that would never benefit America. They couldn't have been more wrong. Alaska proved to contain vast reserves of gold, oil, and strategic minerals. During World War II, Alaska became a crucial military base. The Aleutian Islands were actually invaded by Japanese forces, making Alaska the only American territory attacked during the war. But Alaska's real value became clear during the Cold War. The shortest route between the United States and the Soviet Union was over the North Pole, directly through Alaska. Military bases in Alaska who detect incoming Soviet bombers and missiles. Alaska wasn't a frozen wasteland. It was America's first line of defense. When Alaska became the 49th state in 1959, it was the largest state in the Union by far. At 663,300 square miles, Alaska was more than twice the size of Texas. It had fewer than 250,000 people, making it also the least populated state. But size and population didn't matter. Alaska was American, and Americans deserved statehood. 14. Hawaii, paradise, joins the Union. Hawaii's story was completely different, but equally dramatic. The Hawaiian Islands had been an independent kingdom until 1893, when American businessmen overthrew Queen Liliuokalani in a controversial coup. The United States annexed Hawaii in 1898, making it a territory. For 60 years, Hawaii remained in territorial limbo. The islands were dominated by a few wealthy families who controlled the sugar and pineapple plantations. Most Hawaiians had little political power, and many Americans saw Hawaii as too foreign, too Asian to be a proper state. But World War changed everything. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, brought Hawaii to the center of American consciousness. Hawaiian soldiers fought bravely in the war, including the famous 442nd Infantry Regiment, composed mostly of Japanese Americans who proved their loyalty despite facing discrimination at home. After the war, Hawaii's push for statehood became unstoppable. The territory had proven its loyalty, its strategic value, and its American identity. When Hawaii became the 50th state in 1959, it completed a journey that had begun 172 years earlier, with 13 small colonies on the Atlantic coast. 15. The legacy from sea to shining sea. And so, the story ends where it began, with an impossible dream that became reality. From 13 colonies clinging to the Atlantic coast to 50 states spanning a continent and beyond. From 2.5 million people to over 330 million. From 360,000 square miles to 3.8 million square miles. This is more than just a story of expansion. It's the story of an idea. The idea that ordinary people can govern themselves. The idea that new territories can become equal partners, not colonial subjects. The idea that democracy can stretch across vast distances and diverse populations. The American expansion wasn't perfect. Native Americans paid a terrible price. Slavery nearly destroyed the Union. Wars were fought, lives were lost, and mistakes were made. But the core idea survived, that people can create something greater than themselves through cooperation and shared values. When we look at a map of the United States, it's easy to forget that none of this was inevitable. Each state represents countless individual decisions to leave everything behind and start over. Each star on the flag represents a community that chose to join something larger than itself. From 13 to 50. From sea to shining sea. From a revolutionary idea to the most powerful nation on Earth. This is the ultimate timeline of American expansion, and it's the greatest story ever told. And please, if you enjoyed our video, subscribe our channel and wait for the next surprise.